Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the virtual version of Mr. Dwyer's classroom. I know you are all missing me on the snow day terribly, so we're going to report from home today. I'm going to split this into two videos. One short video on the cognitive stuff that I went over in class, and then I'll do one short video on the biomedical therapy that I would have talked about in class. So remember, when I see you next, this is for first, third, and fifth period. You guys should be ready with research check 1 listed on your project sheet and be ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Here we go. So within psychology and therapies, over the last few years, the cognitive approach has really come to dominate all of psychology. And you can see within the graph that 49% of all therapies are done with the cognitive approach. And the cognitive approach treats a lot of different disorders. So people who are working on their research project, you're probably going to notice that nearly all disorders are helped with some type of cognitive training using the major ideas from the cognitive perspective. So it's really a broad therapy that helps a lot of different disorders. If we're familiar with the cognitive perspective in general, then it's going to make a lot of sense what cognitive therapy is. So last class we talked about behaviorism, which was all about the external environment. Cognitive therapy basically takes those ideas about the external environment, but assumes that it's not just the learned experience that creates our emotional state, it's our interpretation of the learned experience. So they always say that there's a thought that exists between the action and how we feel about ourselves. So, with the environment, we're always trying to interpret whether it was a good event, a bad event, etc. And people who need cognitive therapy obviously have troubling thoughts that are irrational. They may interpret things in unhealthy ways. So obviously the goal of cognitive therapy is going to be to teach people healthier ways of thinking. Here are two really important people that we're going to have to know. You're going to have to know Aaron Beck is associated with cognitive therapy, who I'm going to talk about in general, and his therapy literally is just known as cognitive therapy. We'll also talk about Albert Ellis's rational emotive therapy, which combines elements of behaviorism and the cognitive perspective. So we'll start with Aaron Beck. So Aaron Beck was most famous for discussing his cognitive interpretation of depression. So he noticed and did a lot of studies of people who were depressed and noticed that their thought patterns were not rational, and they had certain ways of thinking about themselves which caused them to feel worthless, incapable, incompetent, and common thought patterns that would lead to depression. Two of those schemas that he specifically talked about were arbitrary interference and dichotomous thinking. So arbitrary interference is this certain schema that people with depression usually have, where we'll draw a negative conclusion from something that happens to us without any evidence. So it's just a totally arbitrary thought that we have. So it'd be like if you were at the grocery store and the grocery clerk is really rude to you, arbitrary interference would be like, that person doesn't like me. Obviously, maybe the person doesn't like you, but most likely there's other reasons why they might have acted like that. So arbitrary interference is just that schema that people who are depressed have, where they just automatically draw negative conclusions. Dichotomous thinking is also really common in people with depression, where they have this irrational all or nothing thought process, which is very unhealthy. So dichotomous thinking is most common in suicidal patients, and you can think of suicide as the ultimate all or nothing thought. Either I want to live or I want to die. But you can see the example that's on here. I can't be happy unless everyone likes me. That's a very dangerous thought to have, because it's impossible for everyone to like you. So that person sets up an impossible situation with that thought for themselves to ever be happy. Next thing that we're going to discuss is this cognitive triad that basically Aaron Beck discussed. So Aaron Beck believed that there were three things that the thought patterns of a depressed person were focused on in a negative way. So he basically thought that First of all, patients with depression had negative views of themselves. So when things happened, they usually tended to blame themselves. They had negative views of their world, and they had negative views of their future. So in cognitive therapy, what that's going to do is he would obviously focus on the thoughts about yourself, your world, and your future that are leading to those depressed thoughts. And you can kind of see this is in common with Seligman's idea of learned helplessness. Same idea where which causes us to give up sometimes, where we have this negative explanatory style and you think you can't control your environment, which remember was an external locus of control. And basically, depressed people, when they see their problems, they view them as personal, thinking that they caused it. So if you failed a test, you would think, oh, I'm stupid. It's my fault that I failed this test. You think that it's pervasive, meaning that it's going to affect everything you do. Meaning, so if you failed the test means that you're going to fail the class. And if you failed the class, that means you're stupid in general and probably not going to get into college. And if you can't get into college, you're probably not going to get a good job. And you can see how this pervasive, how depression feeds off of itself. And then you usually think it's permanent. You don't think that the negative thoughts are ever gonna go away, and all of those thoughts together, along with an external locus control, can lead to learned helplessness. And this is also tied to pervasive pessimism, is tied to a locus of control. So when people with depression are very pessimistic, it shows that they have this reverse of the self-serving bias, where most people usually, when something good happens to them, they tend to say, oh, I'm awesome. But people with depression usually have a pervasive pessimism where they will say anything good that happens to them, they'll say, oh, that was random luck. Anything bad that happens to them, they'll usually think is their fault, though. So you can see it's sort of the opposite. And both pervasive pessimism and pervasive optimism are dangerous. So the second type of therapy we're going to talk about is rational emotive therapy, which is just basically combining elements of the cognitive perspective with the behavioral perspective. So the only difference between this and basic cognitive perspective is that it's going to also reflect on how your thoughts affect your behaviors. So you can see there where irrational thought patterns would be the thought, the compulsions within OCD would be the behavior. So it's going to work on both the internal thoughts and the behaviors associated with that. And the major theorist behind that is Albert Ellis. So Albert Ellis basically, again, believed that, excuse me, that maladaptive thoughts led to maladaptive emotional responses. And basically, he promoted this form of treatment known as rational emotive behavior therapy. And this, out of all the therapies, is the most combative of all therapies. It would almost, during this therapy, he would often almost get into semi-arguments with people so that he could confront them and so that they could realize the irrationalities of their thoughts. So he would constantly question you, ask about your assumptions about why you're feeling that way, and try to show you that you really do have irrational thought patterns. And then once you come to the self-awareness or gain the insight about your thought patterns, then he's going to help you form healthier forms of thinking. So in general, you can just see this graph that shows the benefit of cognitive therapy. So that's got to control people on the waiting list versus who weren't on the waiting list. Obviously, the people who had cognitive training had lower depression scores. So I think cognitive therapy in general is pretty easy for most of us to understand if you're pretty familiar with the cognitive perspective. Basic idea is irrational thoughts, negative thoughts, harmful thoughts are what causes a disorder. And what basically cognitive therapists are going to do is help you gain insight, recognize your thought patterns, and then be able to replace them with healthier thought patterns. And that process in general is called cognitive restructuring. So cognitive restructuring is that idea that you want to realize your wrong thoughts and be able to replace them with healthier thought patterns. Make sure that you go ahead and answer the questions that go along with this that I attach in the email that I send to everybody, and we're good to go, and we're going to switch over to biomedical therapy in the next video.